Hello boys and girls, David Ansardi back here again, and I am going to give you a two-part lecture. So if you're following along with your PowerPoint note printouts, this 3.6 motor units and muscle contractions, I'm going to divide this up into two video lectures because I am so long-winded I just can't get through it without it becoming too long. All right, so far you have heard the story about how motor neurons stimulate individual muscle fibers. And remember, a muscle fiber is one single muscle cell within a skeletal muscle to contract. Now, that's at the microscopic level. Now, for this lecture, we're going to continue to talk about some things at the microscopic level, but we're also going to be thinking about whole skeletal muscles and how they contract. And a whole skeletal muscle is going to be composed of thousands and thousands and thousands, if not millions, of these muscle fibers, some of which contract simultaneously when you are going to contract one of your skeletal muscles to help you do some work. So on this first slide, let me get my pen up here so I can write stuff on the screen. Behave. All right. Oops. Hang on. This first slide here is a graphic representation of a muscle twitch. And we can think about a muscle twitch occurring within an individual muscle fiber, that's one muscle cell in a skeletal muscle, or you can really think about it occurring across a whole skeletal muscle when it is undergoing contraction. Well, let's talk about what is a muscle twitch. A muscle twitch, this is really referring to one cycle of stimulation of a muscle fiber which causes it to contract, followed by relaxation. And a muscle twitch can actually be represented graphically like we see here on this slide. And on this graph, the y-axis, this is your percentage of maximum tension or force of contraction within a muscle fiber or the whole muscle. And on your x-axis for this graph down here, you're looking at the passage of time, and notice your time units here are ms. That stands for milliseconds. 1 millisecond is 1/1000th of a second. So we're down in a time frame which is going to happen in a fraction of a second. So what is a muscle twitch? If you look over here, this little arrow here shows you single stimulus. What is stimulating a muscle fiber to contract? It's a motor neuron. Motor neuron generates an action potential, and you've already seen the story about how that action potential on the motor neuron leads to an action potential on the muscle fiber, which consequently leads to your actin, myosin filaments inside that muscle fiber cross-bridging and sliding across each other to cause a contraction to take place. So that's where the stimulus is. The stimulus is that action potential that has been generated on the motor neuron. Now look at our graph here. Notice that right after that stimulus takes place for a really brief period of time, there's no contraction within the muscle fiber. What's happening during that time period? That's when that action potential winds up spreading across the muscle fiber membrane, the sarcolemma, which then triggers calcium to be released from the sarcoplasmic reticulum in the muscle fiber. Remember that story from your last lecture on the neuromuscular junction. And then remember, that leads to your cross-bridging of your actin and myosin fibers, which then go through their cycle of bridging, releasing, bridging, releasing, bridging, releasing, which causes the sliding. And that leads to contraction. So during this little first part here, that's when all that stuff that leads to the cross bridges forming takes place. So it's really, really fast, almost instantaneous. Then once those cross bridges start forming, that's when you start generating contraction in the muscle fiber as those actin and myosins are sliding. And pretty quickly, you see here on the graph, that's going to reach its peak contraction. And then it will start to relax. you have a period of relaxation that takes a little longer. What's happening then, if you think back to the story you just heard about the neuromuscular junction, that's when the calcium, you got to have that out there to allow the actin and the myosin filaments to form those cross bridges. It's getting bottled back up into the sarcoplasmic reticulum. And the acetylcholine, remember that, the neurotransmitter there at the neuromuscular junction, it's getting broken down. And when those two things happen, that's when you have your relaxation. Okay, so again, a muscle twitch, that's just one cycle. Zap from the motor neuron, the muscle fiber contracts and then it relaxes. And if you're thinking about lots of muscle fibers within a muscle doing that simultaneously, this one little round of contraction relaxation, that would be a muscle twitch across the whole skeletal muscle. This diagram, which comes from your textbook, is just showing you the duration of these twitches. You know, how long does it take to go through a contraction relaxation phase? That can vary from one skeletal muscle to another. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this slide. You can take a look at it in your textbook. But if you look right here on the graph, they're showing you a muscle with a very fast twitch, contracts and relaxes really quickly. And those types of twitches are characteristic of muscles such as one of your extraocular muscles. That's a muscle that controls some of your eye movements. Those types of muscles make really fine, delicate movements. So they need to be able to contract and relax really, really quickly because you've got to make really fine-tuned type movements with those. But look over here, the twitch graph here for the soleus, and hopefully in lab by now you have learned that the soleus is the deeper of your two calf muscles. You use those calf muscles for big, powerful movements like jumping up off the ground or coming up on your tiptoes, which require quite a bit of force to bear your body weight. Those types of muscles will have longer twitch periods where they contract and relax. To go through one cycle of contraction and relaxation takes a longer period of time. Okay, now you guys know that when your muscles contract to help you do work, like if you pick up something off of the table, like this was something heavy, and you're picking that up with your fists, you're contracting your biceps brachii muscle so that you can flex your elbow joint. Now you guys know that your biceps brachii muscle is not going through just one little twitch in a fraction of a second and contracting and relaxing to make that happen. If you're sitting here holding a heavy weight, that muscle is going to have to contract for a long period of time. It's going to have to maintain that contraction to help you do that work. And that's how your muscles actually operate. So how does that happen? Okay, so this slide is showing, this is a different representation of what we saw over here. One single twitch, contract and relax. Just the scale is a little bit lower on this particular graph. Okay, and again, one stimulus from a motor neuron leads to one twitch in a muscle fiber. Okay, now take a look at this graph. This is starting to show us what's really happening inside a real muscle. Okay, if you look over here on the left, the little red arrow there, that is an action potential stimulus coming from a motor neuron. And notice muscle fiber goes through one twitch. It's starting to relax. But notice down here on this graph you have a second stimulus. You have a second action potential that arrives from the motor neuron. So that muscle fiber is stimulated again. So before those sarcomeres inside that muscle fiber completely relax, you have another round of contraction that takes place again. Okay? And what happens then, those actin and myosin filaments in the sarcomeres, okay, when it started to relax, now they're going to contract again. Those actin and myosin filaments can slide a little bit further past each other, so you have more tension developing within the muscle fiber. And then notice it starts to relax again. You get another stimulus from a motor neuron, which allows those actin and myosin filaments to slide even further across each other. The farther they slide across each other, the more contraction tension you have within the muscle fiber. And again, if this is happening in multiple muscle fibers, you're going to have that tension developing across the whole skeletal muscle. Okay, so you can see what happens each time you get another stimulus from a motor neuron. You're going to be able to contract the muscle even a little bit more. This stair-step type effect that you see here with progressively stronger and stronger contractions, there's a name for that, which is pronounced in different ways. Some people say treppy, some people say trep, some people will say treppa. I think treppa is the German pronunciation, but don't quote me on that. All right, now, okay, this graph over here that we were looking at, that looks like a quiver, right? Okay, and your muscles don't. When you're making nice, smooth, coordinated movements, your muscles are not quivering like that. They're contracting and holding that contraction. So how does that take place? Let's look at this graph. And if you look down here on the bottom, you have stimulus after stimulus after stimulus after stimulus after stimulus. And again, these are coming from motor neurons. So what happens is when you have repeated stimuli from the motor neuron over and over again, at first, yes, you're having that kind of stair-stepping effect like we saw on the other graph. But eventually, you're going to get to the point where your actin and your myosin filaments are sliding across each other. You're maintaining tension in that muscle fiber. And before these even have a chance to start relaxing, the muscle fiber gets zapped again by the motor neuron. So they just maintain this state of contraction. And that will be maintained until you are finished using the muscle, and then it will relax. Or it'll be maintained until your muscle becomes exhausted, like it's run out of ATP. You need ATP for muscle contraction, so if you use up all the ATP, that muscle is not going to be able to contract any further. And now sometimes you do see some evidence for that quivering of muscles when a muscle becomes exhausted. It's like if you are depleting your ATP fuel inside a muscle fiber, instead of having a smooth relaxation like you see over here, the muscle will, you're holding that contraction and it's running out of ATP, so it can't hold it all that well. It starts to relax. Another action potential comes from the motor neuron, so it might contract a little bit again, but then it's starting to relax. It's not as good at holding that sustained contraction. So that's when you start, when your muscles get really tired and they start quivering, like if you're sitting here holding a heavy weight, eventually you're going to get to the point where muscles start shaking, and eventually you're going to have to drop the heavy weight because your biceps brachii muscle is exhausted. Okay, so that gives you some idea about how your muscles work in reality as sustaining contractions. Let's talk for a few minutes about motor units. This is another important concept with muscle physiology. So as I mentioned a little bit earlier, a single skeletal muscle in your body is going to be composed of thousands or millions of individual muscle fibers, because an individual muscle fiber is just one muscle cell. So when you contract one of your skeletal muscles, you've got to have many of those muscle fibers contracting simultaneously to make that happen. Now, as it turns out, so in your lectures so far, you've typically seen the story told as you got one motor neuron and it's stimulating one muscle fiber to contract. The reality is that each of your motor neurons controls more than one muscle fiber. Okay, so if we take a look at this little diagram over here, this is a representation, this is a cross-section through your spinal cord, and hopefully you have learned that your motor neurons are located there, in your spinal cord. The main cell bodies of the motor neurons are located there, and then their axons extend all the way from the spinal cord to the particular skeletal muscle that that motor neuron controls. So if you look here on this diagram, let me change my pen color over here for a second. I'm going to go to green. Let's look at this motor neuron here. Here's its long axon, and this is traveling through, from the spinal cord, through one of your peripheral nerves out to the skeletal muscle. And notice when it gets to the skeletal muscle, here's our skeletal muscle over here, and we're blowing this up so we can see individual muscle fibers in that muscle. Notice that the axon actually branches and reaches out and contacts this muscle fiber, this one, and this one. Okay, so when that particular motor neuron generates an action potential, it's going to stimulate all three of those muscle fibers to contract. Okay, so that motor neuron and all the muscle fibers it contracts, that's what we call a motor unit. Okay, I'm going to erase that. Let's see, let me do my blue pen here. We don't want to do blue. I'll do green again. Let's look at this other motor neuron over here. There's the cell body, and let's trace its axon all the way from the spinal cord to this particular skeletal muscle. Notice that it branches and reaches out, and it's forming those synapses, those neuromuscular junctions, with this muscle fiber and this one. So that one and that one. So that particular motor unit would be this motor neuron and those two muscle fibers. So that's your concept of a motor unit. A motor unit is one motor neuron and all the muscle fibers that motor neuron controls within a skeletal muscle. In reality, that's going to be from as few as 4, to possibly several hundred, or in some cases over 1,000 muscle fibers contacted from the branches of the axon of one single motor neuron. Okay, another concept that's important about motor units is you got a motor neuron sitting in your spinal cord. The branches of its axons, they will all reach out and contact muscle fibers within the same skeletal muscle. So those branches are not going to spread out and contact separate skeletal muscles. So keep that in mind as well. Let's see, this slide just summarizes a few important concepts about motor units. So we just mentioned motor units can have as few as 4 muscle fibers, and then in other cases you may have hundreds or even over 1,000 muscle fibers in a motor unit. Small motor units are these ones where you just have a few muscle fibers. So when those motor units are stimulated, those muscle fibers are contracting, you have fewer muscle fibers contracting. That's going to generate less force of contraction within that muscle, right? So small motor units, when those get stimulated, those are for like little fine, delicate movements, like movements of your fingers, eye movements, like we were talking about a minute ago with those extraocular muscles that control your eyes. So these little muscles that are important for fine movements, a lot of times those are divided up into lots of little small motor units. Large motor units, these are motor units which have lots of muscle fibers. So when they contract, you're going to generate a lot of force from that contraction. You tend to have large motor units and muscles that have to generate a lot of power, ones that bear weight, like your thighs and your hips. Another important thing to keep in mind with motor units, okay, if the motor neuron in that unit generates an action potential, all of the fibers are going to contract. So a motor unit, the whole motor unit contracts in unison. Another important thing, muscle fibers from one motor unit, they're spread throughout the whole skeletal muscle. They're not all bundled up there closely together within the muscle. And that's important too, because when you stimulate one motor unit to contract, if the fibers that it's controlling that are within that motor unit are scattered around, then the whole muscle will wind up contracting. If they were all bundled up together in one location, just that little section of a muscle might contract. So that winds up being important. Another thing, too, an individual skeletal muscle is going to be divided up into many, many, many motor units. And even if you're going to contract that muscle with as much force as you can, you're not going to simultaneously contract all of the motor units. If you did that, that muscle would fatigue really, really quickly. So what the brain does, the brain is what coordinates all of this. And what it does is the brain stimulates some motor units within the muscle to contract, and then they relax, and other motor units take over. And then they relax, and then other motor units take over. So you spread out the contractions, and that helps prevent fatigue of the muscle. So let's talk a little bit more about how these motor units within a particular muscle are controlled. Because as you guys know, your muscles obviously don't always contract with the same amount of force. If I'm going to use my biceps brachii muscle here to flex my elbow joint here, the amount of force that's required for that is going to depend on what I'm lifting. I might not be lifting anything at all, so that's not going to require much force. If this little doohickey here weighed 50 pounds, that would require a much stronger contraction from my biceps brachii muscle to allow me to carry out that flexion of the elbow. So how does one of your skeletal muscles know how to contract more or less forcefully? The brain, or your central nervous system. Your central nervous system controls this, your CNS. Usually it's the brain, but when you learn about reflexes, when you get into Unit 4 on the nervous system, some of your muscle contractions sometimes are the brain doesn't get involved. It's actually controlled by neurons that are located within the spinal cord itself. Okay, so if you need to contract a muscle more forcefully, then the brain is going to, or your central nervous system, will recruit more motor units for contraction. If you need to just make a little wimpy, delicate movement with a skeletal muscle, the central nervous system is going to recruit fewer motor units to contract. So let's see what we mean by that. If we look at this, we got a series of 3 little diagrams here on this slide. And if you look, first little graph here, this is showing a stimulus voltage. And down here, these little arrows down here are indicating a stimulus that's being applied to the motor neuron that controls particular motor units within a muscle. Back in your lecture on action potentials, you learned about threshold, okay, and how the membrane of a motor neuron has to reach threshold voltage, and once that happens, the action potential will be generated. Okay, so the central nervous system stimulating motor neurons, trying to trigger them to reach thresholds, so they'll generate their action potentials. So these little arrows you see here, these are stimuli that are coming from the central nervous system being applied to motor neurons. Notice in the first 2 stimuli that we're looking at here, there's not enough stimulation there for any of the motor units within this particular skeletal muscle we're looking at to be recruited to contract. So, and we can see that here in the second little diagram here. These are supposed to represent cross sections of skeletal muscles, and each of those little circles in there is representing an individual motor unit within that muscle. So first 2 stimuli, and again, this is input coming from the central nervous system trying to stimulate a particular muscle to contract. You don't have enough stimulation yet for any of the motor units to reach that threshold, which is required to generate an action potential. But notice here, when you get to number 3, there's been enough stimulation from the central nervous system for some of the motor units to wind up reaching threshold. So they're stimulated, the muscle fibers within those motor units contract and relax. Now notice when you keep applying more and more stimulus to these motor units, more and more motor units become recruited. Okay, so some of these motor units require more stimulation to reach this threshold value. More and more stimulation. Look down here. As you progress through here, more and more motor units get contracted. And if you look down here, this is our little twitch diagram again. You see the more motor units that get recruited, the more force of contraction will take place within that particular skeletal muscle. Another way to look at this is here on this diagram. So here's your tension within a whole skeletal muscle on this side. And down here, over time, we're looking at stimulation coming from the central nervous system. Very often that's coming from the brain. You'll learn more about that in Unit 4. At first, with a low level of stimulation, you're just going to have some motor units recruited. So just some muscle fibers within that muscle are going to contract. And so you're going to have some contraction here within that muscle. As more stimulation continues to occur, more motor units are recruited. Now the other ones over here that were recruited first, they're still being recruited. They're receiving enough stimulation to keep contracting. So now you just have more motor units activating, more tension within that muscle. And then finally, with even more and more and more stimulation, eventually all of the motor units wind up receiving enough stimulation to contract. They all become recruited, and that's when you wind up having the most contraction force within a particular skeletal muscle. Okay, so this idea of more and more and more motor units being recruited as a particular muscle needs to generate more and more and more force for contraction is very, very important. That control is what gives you these very fine, coordinated, precise controls of your muscles. And you see evidence all the time for your central nervous system controlling the amount of force of contraction when you use a particular muscle. Just the other night, for example, there was a cup of what I thought was an empty cup sitting on my kitchen counter. So I walked over to it. I picked the cup off of the counter. My brain is thinking, oh, well, this is an empty cup. It's going to be really, really light. So my brain did not recruit very many motor units within my biceps brachii muscle to contract. So when I picked this cup up off of the table, muscle didn't generate enough force, and I almost dropped the cup. Okay. If I had known that that cup was full of water, my brain would have realized that it needed to recruit more motor units within this muscle to contract. So I would have had enough force generated to lift that cup up. Or I'm sure each of us has at some point seen something over sitting on a table and we thought, oh, that looks like it's going to be really heavy. And you go over and you pick it up and you practically throw it back over your shoulder because you lift it with too much force. Again, that's evidence that your brain is, in that case, recruited too many motor units. You generated too great of a force of contraction within that skeletal muscle. All right, so this is where I'm going to end the first portion of this particular lecture, and I will pick up with some other topics on muscle contractions in the second half.